We're looking at the royal tombs of Ur. Uh, let's look at another one of these so-called royal tombs. This is called the Tomb of Mescalando because the name Mescalando was inscribed on a gold bowl that you'll see in a couple of pictures. Um, so here you can see this is the location of the tomb. This is just another view from a different angle. What they found was a burial of a body in a chamber, and again, all of these gold vessels with the name Mescalando. Uh, they don't know if this is actually a king or not. Some people speculate that this is a king named Mescalando, but there's no title on the bowls, just the name. And as you'll see, on the cylinder seal of some of the queens or high priestesses, there's a title given. On many of the cylinder seals of kings, the title is given as well. So some people think he might be a high priest. Not a high priest, sorry, a prince. So the son of a king. Now, as we're going to talk more about, all of these materials, or most of the materials in these graves, are made from raw materials that are not found in southern Mesopotamia. All of this material had to be traded for. There's no gold, there's no metals, there's no stone, there's no wood in southern Mesopotamia. So all of this stuff is imported. So here's where the body of Mescalando was found, along with weapons. And we're going to be talking about the growth of kingship and how kingship is tied very closely to warfare in the early dynastic. They also found this helmet, really beautiful helmet, that shows that what we call that royal hairdo, right? That hairdo that's usually associated with kings, with a bun in the back. We saw this in the Uruk period. We see it throughout the early dynastic. Whenever we see kings in art, they usually have this special hairdo. So here's a gold helmet using that symbol. This is kind of a computer model showing all the objects that were found in the tomb of Mescalando. Okay, let's look at another tomb nearby. This tomb was called by Leonard Woolley the King's Tomb, right? So you can see right here. He didn't know whether it was a king's tomb or not, because this chamber where the royal person probably would have been buried was empty of a body. But what was found were retainers, 63 bodies of other people, mostly women. Right? So you can see some of the skulls as they were mapped out by Leonard Woolley. Mostly women over here. There was an ox cart here. You can see the oxen. And then there was a group of soldiers over here. So this chamber was probably looted in ancient times. So some people have even speculated whether this was the tomb of Mescalando, based on the small fragments of artifacts that have been found in the main chamber. Leonard Woolley drew the conclusion that it was a male who's buried here, but some people are not so sure about that. That's really kind of an assumption. Also found in the king's tomb, right, in the what's called the death pit. So Leonard Woolley's terminology again. He usually talks about the grave chamber, and then outside there might be all these retainers who are also buried with the royal person, and he usually referred to that area as the death pit. They found this beautiful lyre, and what was preserved was, you can see the gold covered on wood. And this is Lapis Lazuli, this blue stone. This is only found in Afghanistan. And so it had to be traded over many, many miles to get to southern Mesopotamia. Some people think that this is symbolic of the sun god Utu, because Utu is sometimes said in the mythology to have a beard of lapis lazuli. On the bull-headed lyre, they found this beautiful piece of shell inlay, and it's organized into 4 panels. The top panel has kind of a hero motif. This is, again, like we've seen this motif before, Mesopotamian art. Usually a hero struggling with animals, wrestling bulls or lions or things like that. Then it's kind of interesting. We have animals kind of acting out the roles of humans, bringing food. It looks like a funeral feast, kind of what the death pit looked like, playing a lyre like the one it's decorating. And then at the bottom is a scorpion man. And scorpion men, as you read in Gilgamesh, are usually the guardians to the underworld. So some people think that this is kind of showing death and the journey to the underworld, maybe of this individual, the hero, the funeral, and then the descent into the underworld. That's one idea for the symbolism here. With the soldiers, we're going to be talk a little bit more about the soldiers, because one of the soldiers' skulls that made its way to the University of Pennsylvania was recently CAT scanned, and they found out some interesting information based on the CAT scan of that soldier. But you can see the weapons that were found with those soldiers. So how did all these people end up buried with this royal person? Well, Leonard Woolley's idea was that during the funeral for this individual, this king, they got the ox cart, all the women servants, the soldiers. They marched down into the death pit. The king was buried in this separate chamber. And then, according to Leonard Woolley, because he found cups, gold cups in many of these death pits, he believes they all drank poison and then were laid out. They died in the death pit and then were sort of carefully placed by people conducting the funeral, and then they were buried. So there was definitely this kind of performance to the funeral and to the burial. This was one of the important features, according to Leonard Woolley, of these royal graves, that they had this ritual aspect to them, an actual ritual being performed at the funeral and involving the deaths of others, these sacrificial victims, human sacrifices. Okay, so that's the king's tomb, and right next to it is one of the most famous tombs of the royal tombs at war, and because it was mostly intact, I think basically intact, and it is of a queen or a royal woman. There's debate about whether she was a queen or not, but in this chamber they found this royal woman along with 3 servants and then 21 other people in the death pit, along with 2 oxen that were pulling this sledge over here. So let's look at some of the contents of the queen's tomb. Now, the queen is known as Puabi, and we know her name from the cylinder seal that was found right near her in her burial chamber. Okay, as we're going to see, many of these female servants were finely decorated with gold and lapis jewelry, and Puabi even more so. Right? Okay, so let's take a look at some of the things that were found. This so-called chariot was actually a sledge. It didn't have wheels. It actually was, a sled, which would have been useful in Mesopotamia because, again, it's a silty area. Wheels could get stuck in the soft ground unless there's actually a paved road. One of the interesting things about all of these burials, and we're going to, I'll kind of emphasize this again, is in the cuneiform documents, there's no evidence of human sacrifice. There's no mention of human sacrifices in burials, in funerals. We only know about this from archaeology. So it looks like this was probably a practice early on that may have died out and maybe was even forgotten about as the history became more elaborate, as more and more texts were written down in the later part of the early dynastic and the next periods. That's some of the thinking. Okay, here's the excavation of that chariot or sledge. Here's Catherine Woolley and Leonard Woolley and the workers over here. And you can see some of the lions that were decorating this sledge. Okay? And this is kind of a reconstruction of maybe what it looked like. Right in front of it were the skeletons of 2 oxen, and you can see this bit reins. This is where the reins and the bits would have passed through to hold the head of the oxen. You can see it's finely decorated with silver, and this gold donkey on top of it. One of the female servants, you can see how neatly they were laid out, had one of these lyres or harps. Again, you can see them excavating it out, and this is what it looks like reconstructed, similar to the one that was found in the king's chamber. And there were 2 of these found in this death pit of Puabi. There was also a chest, and in the death pit, lots of different vessels, like stone vessels, silver vessels. We're going to talk about gaming boards that were found throughout the royal tombs of Ur. Now let's look at the main chamber of Puabi. So this is where the body of Puabi was laid out. It was clear that she was the individual that this was intended for in this chamber. She's the only one in this chamber laid out on this kind of bier, this one bier, and lots of objects around her. We don't know exactly how the objects fit together, as you'll see, but we can definitely tell what the items were. Now, this is the head of Puabi with all of this elaborate finery. We're going to see some reconstructions of what this looked like. Lots of gold leaves, cylinder seal, other ornaments right here. These are some of the pieces as they were excavated. Right, so this was never looted, so we have kind of an intact tomb of this royal person. Now, right near her head was a cylinder seal, and on the cylinder seal has her name, Puabi, and it has the title Nin, which means high status woman. Queens are called Nin, but also high priestesses could be called that. And high priestesses within the temple were usually from the royal family anyway. So many people believe that, yes, she was a queen. Some people think she might have been a high priestess. There's debate about that. It's possible she could have been a high priestess at one time and then a queen. Right, so her name and her title are on the cylinder seal, but usually with the cylinder seals of women, possibly the husband would be mentioned, the king, or the father of the woman, but they are not on this cylinder seal. So there's some speculation that maybe she ruled as a queen in her own right. And there were 2 other cylinder seals showing feasting, like the feasting that is hypothesized to have gone on in these death pits. In the Queen's Chamber were also these beautiful drinking vessels. This one they think was used for beer. It kind of has this spout here, so it would filter out the yeast and the other things. They found decorated ostrich shells in this area. You could see just a tremendous amount of wealth is obviously being found with these royal people. Also, stone vessels made out of calcite and gypsum and alabaster and other things. A bronze boat model you can see here, as well as this beautiful silver lion head, a cosmetic box you can see here, made with lapis and also with bone, and a shell made out of gold with cosmetics inside. So we have some idea of some of the cosmetics that a high status woman would have had back in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, when all of this was pulled out, it was reconstructed, attempt to reconstruct it as it would have looked like on Queen Puabi herself. Now, she was laid out on her back with her hands resting over her abdomen. From the skeleton, they think she was under 5 feet tall, just under 5 feet, She was probably around 40 years of age at the time of her death, and her body was covered with beads of gold, lapis, a red stone called carnelian, and also agate. And this is a reconstruction of the headdress you can see here. These rosettes might be symbols of Inanna, and all of the agate beads. They don't know exactly how all these fit together. They're pretty clear that this was some sort of belt. And they think maybe these carnelian beads and agate beads and gold beads and lapis beads here form some sort of cape. This weighed several pounds. So this was a lot of material buried with this royal woman. After the excavation, or during the excavation, news media was sort of reconstructing what Puabi might have looked like. And even later in the 50s, this is Life magazine showing Puabi, and as you can see, it says primping in ancient Sumer from 1956. So Woolley had a specific interpretation because the king's chamber was here, and above it was that death pit and the queen's chamber. So he came up with this story that that Puabi, when Puabi died, she died after her husband. Woolley claimed that her husband was buried in this chamber. That when she died, she wanted to be as close to her former husband as possible. And so her chamber was built right up against it, and even actually slightly lower than it, so that she could be with him in the afterlife. Now, his interpretation is contradicted by further analysis today, because actually the chamber of the queen is slightly lower than the king. So they think that actually the queen's chamber is probably earlier than the king's chamber. Also, the death pit that he thought was associated with Puabi's burial, this death pit here, is actually fairly higher than the queen's chamber. And so many scholars today think that this death pit is actually associated with some other royal person who was not excavated, and that Queen Puabi may have a death pit somewhere over here that was never excavated, or maybe even under the death pit of the king that was never excavated. Right? So there's some debate about this. Either way, we have a pretty strong indication that these are powerful people who have wealth and also have the power of life and death. There are people who are following them in the afterlife. We'll talk about whether it's voluntary or involuntary. All right, one of the other interesting finds, I find this to be really interesting, some of you might find it pretty cool too, is that they found several versions of a board game in the royal tomb. This board game is called 20 Squares. Usually it's referred to as game of 20 Squares. It was played in Egypt. It probably originates from Mesopotamia. The Egyptians had a different board game called Senet, but they also played this game too. And it's essentially a race game. You try to get your pieces around the board and off of the board. You roll these triangular dice, and many people believe that the squares with rosettes are safe spaces and you can't be kicked off them. But if an opponent's piece lands on, let's say, your piece on one of these other pieces, you have to start over again. Now, if you want to play the royal game of Ur, you can play it. There's many versions of it on Android and iPhone. Just look up on the Google Play or the Google App Store or the Mac App Store. If you look up Game of Ur or Game Ur, you'll find different versions of it. There's several free versions. If they're not free, they're usually pretty inexpensive. But you should be able to find a free one if you want to just kind of see what it was like. Some people think it's the predecessor to backgammon.